Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is a webinar series that is focused on many of the topics that we have been discussing throughout the series. Today's discussion is titled How to Make COP27 a Success, an all-society sectoral approach to delivering climate action. With us today is Professor Thomas Hale. He will explore how we can manage transitional problems effectively and fairly. He seeks to explain how political institutions evolve or not to face the challenges raised by globalization and interdependence, with the particular emphasis on environmental, economic, and health issues. So it's a broad discussion today that should cover many, many topics. Professor Thomas Hale holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics, and an AB in public policy from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. A US national, Hale has studied and worked in Argentina, China, and Europe. His books include Beyond Gridlock, Between Interests and Law, the Politics of Transitional Commercial Disputes, Transnational Climate Change Governance, and Gridlock, Why Global Cooperation is Failing When We Need It the Most. Thomas Hale leads the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker. I'm very pleased to welcome you today, and we will have questions all throughout in the chat box, please. And also please reserve raising your hands when you have questions to the end of the lecture. Professor Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm very grateful to the Center at AUC for hosting this talk and the series of talks, which is really a fascinating set of issues brought to the fore. Today, I'd like to speak particularly about an important moment coming up toward the end of this year that will take place in Egypt, COP27, the 27th Conference of the Parties. I'd like to ask the question of how we can think about this important event as a success, what will make it a success. I'd like to propose to you that to see success in Sharm el-Sheikh this November, when the conference will take place, we actually need to think about some big trends that are taking place in global governance broadly and global climate governance in particular. And these trends can really be summarized as what you might think of as an all-of-society approach. We're bringing together not just national governments, but also cities, businesses, investors, civil society, and many others to the solution. And we're doing so not just in a way looking at the overall economy, the overall society, but taking specific sectoral approaches, looking at individual areas. So that's what I'm hoping to talk about tonight. I'm really looking forward to your questions and ideas. The reason why I'm starting with success or failure, because that's how the media tends to talk about these big international summits. The most recent one to take place was, of course, COP26, the 26th meeting of the parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which unfolded here in Glasgow, Scotland, in December of last year. And of course, people always want to know, was it a success or not? And if you looked into the media, you probably saw two different narratives on that point. Just to summarize them with a few short videos. So one narrative is summarized by the video on the left, which was a scene of celebration in one of the rooms taking place where all these actors I had mentioned, the cities, the businesses had gotten together and had delivered real important commitments to reduce emissions, to enhance resilience, to make finance flow. And this is how they were feeling at the end of the COP. So as you can see, a real air of celebration and a sense of accomplishment of what had been done. But in the same event, at the very same time, there was another narrative taking place that's also important to consider. And that was given by the climate change activist Greta Tunberg in some of her remarks during the COP, which I'll play for you here.
This is no longer a climate conference. This is now a global North greenwash festival. The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announcing fancy commitments and targets, while behind the curtains, the governments of the global North countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action.
So two extremely different narratives around the success or the failure of COP26. And the question, I guess, is how we can hold these two ideas in our mind at the same time. Were they really at the same event, or are we talking past each other here? Sorry, we're not moving beyond the videos. And of course, the point that Greta Tunberg is making in that video speaks to the very stark reality that we face in the global mitigation challenge, where global emissions are continuing to rise. We're still contributing to climate change. Indeed, we have a huge task to do ahead of us. We know that the goal we're trying to achieve is actually the opposite of this. This is a graph from the IPCC, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, which shows that to reach the temperature goals set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit temperatures to temperature change to well below 2 degrees centigrade in this century, and to try to limit it even to 1.5 degrees, we have to cut our emissions in about half in 2030 and get to a state of global net zero by 2050. So a hugely stark challenge, and that kind of real sober note of where we are in the pace of this transition helps to understand what's going on here. So it's sort of simultaneously true that we're doing much more than we've ever done before and are achieving quite a lot, but also have a huge amount more to go. And so to understand what COP27 might look like and how the prospects for success look like, we need to situate it within these two different narratives, one of accelerating action and progress, and one of the very stark reminder of how much more work we have to do. So today I'd like to try to help us understand sort of that big macro problem by sharing a few ideas on how the global climate change regime, how the UN process and the larger ecosystem institutions around climate action has evolved over time, and to try to use that to understand the prospects for success at COP27. And I also want to say a few words about where we've left off at the end of last year with COP26. What are the outcomes? Where does that leave us? And what therefore needs to be done for COP27? As I said, the key to understanding, I think, the prospects for success at COP27 are really to understand the shift in the climate change regime over time, from what I would call a regulatory regime to a catalytic regime, and to look beyond just national governments to also include other kinds of actors. So this is the outline for what I'd like to share in the next few minutes, and I'd love to hear people's questions and comments and ideas as we go through. So let me start with this idea of how we understand the role of this UN process of COPs, conferences of the parties in the global governance of climate change. And if you think about climate change, you probably have an idea in your mind. This is a fundamental global collective action problem, where we all want to do the right thing. We all want to get to a place where we've brought emissions down, we've built up resilience, and we're all going to enjoy a safe climate for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren. But we all have this difficult free riding problem where everyone wants to, no one has an individual incentive to contribute to that global public good, that global common pool resource. Instead, everyone wants to let others contribute while they hold back. But of course, we have lots of problems like that in the world, which have a sort of global commons nature. And we have a lot of tools in the global governance diplomatic toolkit for how to address them. And the usual way we've gone about addressing that problem is what I'll call the global deal model, or the regulatory model. In other words, what we've been trying in the realm of climate change for the past several decades. So in 1992, when I was in the 4th grade, and probably many people listening to this were not yet born, governments promised international law to limit dangerous temperature changes in the Earth's climate. And then in 1995, they got together at the first COP, which took place in COP1 in Berlin, when Angela Merkel was then actually an environment minister. She's now stepping down, of course, has seen the whole process. And they said, we've got this idea for this goal to limit dangerous temperature change. What we really need is a global deal. We need a global commitment for every country to agree in international law to limit their emissions. And that will help us overcome this difficult collective action problem. Because if I agree to do it and you agree to do it, then together we can all agree and sit down together. We'll be able to begin to make progress on this very large problem. And that was what gave us the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which was always intended as a first step in this journey of reducing the world's emissions by coming up with this kind of global deal. And it was, of course, a modest first step. It was always trying to just be the beginning of a process. And so it had a relatively small level of reductions for countries, and it only required reductions for wealthy countries, the so-called Annex 1 countries, who were developed countries at the time, and of course, who contributed the vast majority of emissions both historically and in 1995, 97, at that moment in history. It had a system for trading emissions across countries as well. And so that was the kind of first attempt to build this global deal, but it really never led to a second step, because before it even came into force, it was undermined by a number of other factors. Number one, the United States never joined the Kyoto Protocol, even though it had been the driving force in many ways behind this negotiation, because the US Congress refused to join up because large emerging economies did not have any obligations under the treaty. But of course, those large emerging economies, the so-called basic countries in the UN process, BASIC stands for Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. Russia is also in different categories, so it's not exactly a BRICS arrangement in the UFCCC. These countries had grown a lot in this time period, and so the global profile of emissions was changing in the present, even though, of course, the history of emissions still had a very strong North American and European footprint. And this trading system that had been developed, the so-called clean development mechanism of exchanging emissions between countries, emissions reductions between countries, actually was pretty undermined by some of the ways they've been set up to allow leakage. But perhaps most importantly, this global deal, this idea of having a binding treaty to hold countries to a common objective on reducing emissions, was only really binding on paper. So when some countries, for example, Canada, became clear they weren't going to meet their obligations under the treaty, they just left the treaty instead of facing the minimal sanctions that would have faced under it. So this was a very disappointing outcome for the world, of course, because it meant that our fundamental governance technology, if you will, for managing these global collective action problems wasn't working the way we had thought. The logic for collective action was to have a collective agreement, to have monitoring and sanctions to ensure compliance, and that would help us to overcome the free rider dilemma. But it didn't seem to work. So what was really interesting, though, is that it didn't just lead to a situation of perpetual gridlock. It actually, over time, and a number of years later, led to a real change in how the world approaches this problem, which is what the COPs look like today. So in 2015, countries came together and developed basically a new strategy for addressing this global collective action problem, which you might call not a regulatory regime, and that's trying to get everyone to agree to a common framework, but instead what you might call a catalytic regime. And it has three real components to it: a pledge, review, and ratchet system. So instead of having every country in the world agree to a common international treaty which specifies you must do this, you must do this, you must do this, instead we have a system of nationally determined contributions, or the pledges that countries make. And as the name implies, these are for the country itself to determine. Every country comes up with its own target. Now everyone has to do it. There's some differentiation between developed and developing countries on the kinds of things that should be in the nationally determined contributions, but they're essentially, you pick your own level of commitment. But that's not the only piece, of course, of the Paris Agreement. Those individual contributions are then reviewed by the international system. So every country has an obligation to put forward a review that is a legally binding requirement to do, although the target itself is not legally binding, not collectively agreed. That's reviewed, and there's various ways to review both the individual targets, but also the collective level of ambition that they add up to see how we're doing on track toward the global goals we've set for ourselves. And critically, the individual pledges are ratcheted up every 5 years or so. So it's not a situation where everyone says whatever they want. So they are allowed to pick their own target, but they must increase them over time. And indeed, they must be at least as strong as they were in the past. So it's a very different logic for how you solve the global collective action problem. And if you think about the sort of conventional view of the tragedy of the commons or the free rider, it seems quite odd because you kind of think, how can this sort of system really help us? Is it really going to work? And we don't know if it's going to work, to be very clear. We're in it. This is why we have these two narratives emerging from Glasgow about the progress being made, but also the scale and scope and difficulty of the challenge to come. What I think this model helps us see, though, is the conditions under which a system like this could work, and therefore it helps us understand where action can be directed to help us go further and faster. Because this so-called catalytic institution doesn't solve the collective action problem by creating global deals that everyone is sort of held to, but rather it helps facilitate cooperation by shifting preferences and strategies over time, not by creating collective agreement, but by building up a critical mass of action, and by using that critical mass of action to drive further action going forward. So it's a very different logic for solving collective action problems, but one that we actually see in a number of other areas as well, although it's probably most developed in the Paris Agreement. So how does this work? Well, as I said, the idea here is not to try to get a global deal, but rather to stimulate first movers and incremental action through flexibility. So you're giving people the opportunity to set their own targets in the hope that they will set targets that they can actually deliver and want to deliver and have investment in delivering, and that those targets may in some cases be very ambitious, may in other cases be a little bit less ambitious, but will always be able to be delivered. Secondly, of course, you have to iterate these commitments. So it's not just allowing people to do whatever they want, but to make sure they're doing it over time. And critically, it's trying to increase the ability of countries to up their game over time by allowing, for example, mechanisms to bring capacity and resources to other countries, to allow them to build up their ability to make more ambitious choices on climate change, by sharing information on how to go about tackling their problems so that they can become more efficient in their climate policies over time, by creating normative pressure and peer pressure and the ability of sort of benchmarking against how you're doing against your peers, and also by building up domestic constituencies where a little bit of action might begin to develop new industries and new groups in society who want to see further action going forward. So through all these systems working together, it is to try to build up a critical mass of action over time and get countries to work together more effectively. This is the logic. And of course, whether or not it works in practice is exactly the question before COP26 and COP27. The other big important change to understand is not just this changing logic of collective action, but the role of actors beyond nation states. So I already mentioned this a few times, but cities, businesses, regions, investors, civil society groups are all playing a huge role in climate change. And one of the key innovations of the 2015 Paris Agreement was to bring that groundswell of activity from outside of the UN process inside the UN process to make it actually core to this idea of building up a critical mass of action over time. And actually its groundswell is quite impressive. So by this kind of non-state actor action, I mean a lot of different things. So it's a very heterogeneous and complicated landscape, but to try to simplify, it means individual actions that a city or a state or province or region might be taking, or that a business might be doing, that's particularly relevant for our conversation here, and investors might be taking. Sometimes those actors are doing it by themselves. Sometimes they're doing it through big networks, like for example, the C40 network of cities, which is a global network of mega cities who are acting collectively on climate change issues. And sometimes those are kind of actor networks that are trying to all set a common target. And sometimes it's a general target, like reducing emissions, and sometimes it's in a very specific area, like on, say, steel or hydrogen or agriculture or any of the other many sectoral areas that we see springing up. And this is a really complex landscape of sectoral climate action. There's many different institutions. Some of them are these non-state actors. Some of them are governmental in nature, and some of them are hybrid, where they mix non-state actors and governmental actors together around a common goal. There's a few examples here on the screen of some of the prominent ones, but there's literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of these types of networks around the world. So what does that all add up to? Well, you can see it's really grown over time. This is a graph showing you the number of these kinds of initiatives I mentioned, the sectoral initiatives over time. It's really spiked up around the 2015 Paris Agreement. As you continued it now, you see even more. And of course, we have a lot of scale and scope inside these many initiatives. So if you add up all of the different subnational jurisdictions, the cities, the regions, the provinces, et cetera, that are acting on climate change, you find about 1 in 5 of every person on Earth lives in one of these acting subnational actors. And if you add up all the companies that the UN records as taking action on climate change, you get something like $36 trillion in annual revenue. It is larger than the GDPs of the United States and China combined. So the website listed here gives you an overview to a UN site that shows you what they're tracking in terms of sub-non-state actors acting. But the key point to take away is that this is not some sort of little side action, right? Together, this is a climate superpower. This is one of the most important actors in the world. And now the regime, the UN regime, is bringing them into the table. Final point on this groundswell, you can see here an estimate of what the actual impact on reducing emissions would be of some of the biggest of these different cooperative hybrid initiatives that I'm mentioning, things like the Under 2 coalition of states and regions, or the New York Declaration on Forests, which is around reducing deforestation. What we tried to do in this report, which I've shown you a key graphic from here, is to see what would actually be the results on emissions if all of these different subnational and non-state and cooperative initiatives delivered the outcomes they're trying to deliver. And what you can see here, it's a little bit complicated, but I can explain it. The graph here shows you the emissions trajectory which from 2010 to 2030. Obviously, the period which from 2020 to 2030 is estimated here, not actual. And it shows you on the right here, the different bars show the amount of reductions we can get from different outcomes. So the blue bar shows you the current national policies, which is estimated before COVID. Again, so it's a few gigatons off the emissions you can see there. If we achieve our NDCs, these nationally determined contributions, we get as low as this yellow bar, but it's pretty good, but not anywhere close to where we need to get to, which is in the 2-degree range, the purple bar, or the 1.5-degree range, the blue bar. If you look on the right, you can see that the green bar is showing you the potential emissions reductions of some of the largest of these cooperative initiatives is in the order of 15 gigatons of emissions. That's out of 55 gigatons projected over current policies. So it's a huge chunk of the problem we might be able to address with these kinds of solutions. As I mentioned, this is happening through this very wide ecosystem of different institutions. The link I've shown here, which you can find in the slides I'll put in the chat later, is a mapping we've tried to do to map out what all these different initiatives are. There's many, many hundreds, as I said, so it's a complicated landscape, but do have a look. But the key point is that this is not happening again outside the UN process, right? It's being brought into the process through something called the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, which is an innovation brought in first sort of envisioned at the 2015 Paris conference, but then enacted at the following one in 2016, which happened to take place in Marrakesh, and was the last time the COP was held in an African country. So at that moment, countries created this thing called the Marrakesh Partnership, which is meant to try to bring in all this sectoral action, all the action by sub and non-state actors to the formal process to help inform what countries were doing and to add up their emissions alongside those of national governments. And obviously, it's not like these things are sort of substituting for or instead of the commitments by national governments. Rather, it's about how we leverage all the tools we need to leverage to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. So 2 ideas here then about how the global governance of climate change has really shifted and why it's quite different from our collective action 101 idea of governments kind of agreeing a treaty and then enforcing it against each other through monitoring and sanctions. We have a much different model here. And so the success of COP26 and COP27 needs to be understood, I would argue, in these terms, as opposed to in the classical terms. Because what we have here is potential to unlock what I think could be really a powerful demonstration of this catalytic logic I said before. So a lot of times we hear now in the climate change regime discussion of the so-called ambition loop. We want to get this virtuous cycle going between setting a target, delivering the action that's needed to help move us toward that target, implementing that action, and therefore creating the conditions under which higher ambition then might emerge in the future. And that's not something for national governments to do in isolation. National governments are the decision makers, are the negotiators, are the ones who agree the targets. But then it's for all of society really to make this ambition loop circle. And that every institution has a role to play in that process. And the COP is now a space where all of those different actors have a voice in trying to make that happen. So let me just pause there and switch gears to talk a bit about that's the theory, what's the practice? Where have we come from COP26, and where are we going from COP toward COP27? COP26 was, as you saw in those videos at the beginning, a contested set of outcomes. So we had basically 4 objectives there. We wanted to ratchet down emissions, ratchet up finance from countries, wanted to finish negotiating some of the rules around the Paris Agreement. We wanted to have this sort of transformation of sectoral goals through this whole of society approach. And we wanted to increase justice by having more protections for the most vulnerable, for example, through loss and damage protections. In other words, compensating people who are already losing lives, losing property, losing other kinds of economic opportunities through the effects of climate change. So how do we do on these? Well, first of all, if you look at the ratchet, which is of course key to this whole catalytic regime that I'm describing, we saw most countries put forward a new NDC, not all of them, but most. And of those, most of the big countries put forward a NDC that had a meaningful update in their emissions reductions targets. There were some exceptions, and so there's more to be done on this front. But in general, we saw what I would call a sort of important, but still a B kind of ratchet or a C plus maybe, but not an A plus. We also saw a lot of announcements beyond nationally determined contributions of sort of long-term net zero targets. And actually, this is one of the areas where we saw a huge amount of change, where now nearly every country in the world has a net zero target if you weight by GDP. And many of these are, of course, more aspirational than robust at this stage. They're also becoming much more ingrained in law. So this is another big trend for longer term targets that we saw brought forward at the COP. If you consider what that gave us in terms of emissions reductions, lots of going on this slide, but just to cut to the point, basically in Paris, we were somewhere around over 3 degree scenario in the policies we have in the books, and a sort of close to 3, but maybe as low as 2.7 or so trajectory. And if you looked at just the targets governments had set. After Glasgow now, after COP26, we brought that down. So we're looking at something like maybe a 2.6 degree scenario if you look at the policies that are actually in effect today, but maybe as low as below 2 degrees if you took account of all of the long-term targets and assumed they were going to be delivered. So we have this sort of ongoing problem where the policies we have are less ambitious than the targets we've set in the short term, which are less ambitious than the more optimistic targets we've set in the long term. But each of those is moving down the curve as we're kind of bending the path of global emissions to be more and more in line with the goals. So the big question for COP27 is, can it continue to bend these policies down and indeed accelerate the pace of descent in some way? And a lot of discussion at COP26 rather was around this 1.5 degree goal. Can we still keep it alive? Is it too ambitious? Has it slipped between our fingers? And that's of course an important thing to keep in our minds. But the fundamental truth here is that every fraction of a degree matters. So yes, 1.5 degrees is a lot better than 1.6, but 1.6 is also a lot better than 1.7. So even as we're trying to define success by these benchmarks we've set, 1.5 and 2 degrees, we need to ensure that the fundamental point is to maximize the amount of reductions we're able to achieve. That's on the mitigation side. Of course, there's a huge amount of need to mobilize finance. Governments did not succeed at COP26 in getting to the goal they had set for themselves in 2009, when they said they would mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020. This is where it stands for about 80 billion by 2019. Still quite a ways to go there. So it's another big agenda item for COP26. On the rules, they finished negotiating the so-called rule book for the Paris Agreement. So that intergovernmental piece was a success. But the real standout piece I'd like to mention is actually on this all of society aspect and the sectoral aspect, where we saw a huge mobilization around COP26 of cities, businesses, regions, investors, et cetera, through a number of global campaigns, such as the Race for Zero, Race to Resilience, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And again, all of these are part of the formal UN Marrakesh partnership process. So a big impact there, and a lot of sectoral initiatives, really dozens of them, maybe more than we even could imagine in previous years, where the first few days of the COP were really jam-packed with announcements on energy, on forests, on steel, on hydrogen, all these kinds of deals. Much less progress on some of the justice agenda, though, where we had some commitments to increase action on a few areas, to double finance for adaptation by 2025, to do more talking about loss and damage, but not really any concrete outcomes on that front. And of course, the urgency and attention to these issues has only gone up as the impacts of climate change have deepened. So even though the number of concrete outcomes were few on this topic, the amount of discussion on it and the amount of attention to it and the level of contestation around it really has increased importantly. Let me try to end fairly quickly by talking about some prospects for COP27, and really the most important point I want to leave you with is, which is what we can all do to help make COP27 a success. So as you probably inferred from my discussion just now, COP26 made some progress, but it left a lot of work to be done. And that's actually really changed the equation, in my view, for COP27 taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh this year, because it's increased the amount of expectations on what COP27 could and should deliver, which is quite a daunting challenge, actually. So if you look across some of the main areas that we discussed at the COP, we see a lot of unfinished business now landed onto the agenda of COP27. On the mitigation front, the outcome of COP26 requests countries to put forward new nationally determined contributions and more long-term strategies by 2022, in other words, by COP27. And so even though the Paris Agreement had envisioned sort of a 5-year cycle, because the NDCs didn't really add up to what we need them to add up to last year, governments have given themselves the opportunity to update them again this year. So this whole kind of rationing idea, which was meant to be taking place last year and did take place to a strong degree last year, is now again on the agenda. So we're really accelerating the cycle of ratcheting, and that creates a fundamentally bigger sort of pressure on COP27 than would have happened otherwise. We also have a really enhanced set of expectations around adaptation. As I mentioned, there's this goal of doubling finance for adaptation, but also the creation of a new work program on how to accelerate adaptation. So what can COP27 deliver on resilience and adaptation is very much in the forefront. And of course, underpinning both those things are a huge set of expectations on finance. This 100 billion goal has not been met. It needs to be met to maintain trust in the process. And so there's this big expectation that COP27 could be a moment for that to finally come to fruition. But at the same time, as the 100 billion goal is being looked to be met, countries are beginning to negotiate the next goal on finance, which will be in effect from 2025. And so that will be very much on the agenda in Sharm el-Sheikh as well. So the expectations are really quite vast, and it's a difficult thing to think about how we really deliver on these kinds of vast expectations, because in this catalytic bottom-up regime that I've been describing, the ability of any country, the host country, Egypt, the other countries that will be trying to contribute to success, will be constrained in how it can affect this change, right? Because national commitments on mitigation or on finance, the NDCs, depend on domestic politics, depend on what decisions are made in Washington and Beijing and Delhi and Brasilia and every other capital in the world. And so the question arises, how do you influence them? How can you shift the position of countries in this short time frame of just a few months? It's also, of course, the first COP in Africa since 2016, as I mentioned, and this expectation for COP27 to really advance the conversation on the priorities of the region is vast. This justice agenda that I mentioned at COP26 was not really sufficient for the expectations that are placed on it. So how can COP27 begin to help to advance those critical questions that are especially important priorities for the region? And finally, how can this COP really help us move to the implementation phase as opposed to just the pledging phase? Remember the ambition loop I presented showed a cycle where you have pledges and you have delivery, and that delivery helps to enable new and better pledges. But if we only stay at the pledge realm, if we're never getting to the delivery and the implementation realm, then that cycle won't flow. And so how can COP27 be not just a kind of new venue where countries can say, in Greta Thunberg's words, blah, 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 companies can stand up and say blah, 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 but actually they can show, I've done this and I can do more. So those are the challenges that the COP really faces. I think, though, there's a pretty clear set of solutions. And there's solutions that I've been talking about throughout, which is around how do you mobilize and really leverage the changes in the climate change regime to better address the kind of difficult politics around increasing ambition and increasing delivery. And so my suggestion would be to follow this all-of-society sectoral focus. First, to try to leverage this groundswell of climate action from cities, from businesses, from others, to really close that ambition loop and to show how the contributions that businesses are making, contributions that cities are making, actually create conditions under which countries can then do more. And when countries do more, that creates conditions under which cities and businesses can deliver more. So getting that really flowing is the only way, I think, to really meaningfully affect the choices being made in the capitals I mentioned before, or indeed any other country. Two, to not get drowned out in the large ecosystem of commitments around different sectors, but to elevate a few top priorities And I would suggest that COP27 is a fantastic opportunity to elevate the priorities of Egypt, of the region, of Africa, of the justice agenda that has been less than prioritized in some previous COPs. So what can COP27 deliver on, say, energy access, on agriculture, on the other kinds of things that are going to be really important for helping ensure that all parts of the world, all populations in the world are able to thrive in a changing climate. And second, last, but maybe most importantly, I really hope to see COP27 focus not just on commitments and pledges, but on delivery and on results. If we can do that, then we can really, I think, change the narrative around moving away from blah, blah, blah to a real acceleration of this ambition loop. So those are the general principles. What does it mean, though, if you're a business for the private sector? What if you're trying to contribute to this goal? Well, first, the good news is that the changes in the global climate change regime mean that now you have a really important role to play. You have the opportunity to not just be a bystander to international negotiations, but to be a driver of the actions that we need to drive. How to do it? Well, one really good way is to join these global campaigns that I mentioned, the ones that are the official UN campaigns for non-state actors in the process. The Race to Zero, the mitigation campaign, Race to Resilience, the adaptation campaign, and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the financial system transformation. Those are, of course, just the overarching kind of general ones, the umbrellas, if you will, but there's this whole ecosystem of individual sectoral action in many different areas that you can explore, and I invite you to check out this map to think about where your business, your organization might best fit into that ecosystem and what niche you could fill. And finally, and this is, again, the most important one, deliver, deliver, deliver. Let's have a COP where people come to the stage with new announcements, with new pledges, with new targets, new ambitions, but let them first say what they've delivered of their previous ones before they begin to make new promises. And I think if we do all those things, we're going to really help create conditions for success at Sharm el-Sheikh this year. So thank you for listening. I'm really looking forward to your questions and can't wait to see hopefully some of you in the COP later this year. Sarah, thanks so much for your attention. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to change the view and just see if hands are raised. And I have a couple of questions myself, and I will keep it till later. Let me first ask Corny, do you have a question? And then followed by Vinette.
Thank you. And hi, Thomas. It's nice to catch up again after a few years. I had a question on your last slide. And this is where you were talking, or the second for last, where you were talking about a few sectoral priorities. I think that what we see is that there is a growing awareness that we need to move towards a deep decarbonization of the whole economy. And the idea of, let's say, picking winners and say, we focus on this sector or we focus on this subsector and things like that, that this time is beyond us. And like, if we really want to move towards the deep decarbonization, we will need to really have a complete sectoral transformation in agriculture, energy, and things like that. The challenge that I see is that, and that was also a lot of the criticism at COP26 in Glasgow, for example, in the transport field, is that there was an undue focus and attention on electric mobility, and that the impression was created that electric mobility would actually solve the problem in the transport sector. So question is, like, if we are really serious about moving towards 1.5, or let's say if I want to keep even my whole hand that we need to move to 0.5, is it not time to abandon this idea that we can just focus on some sectoral topics and that we need to really restructure the whole climate negotiations and that there are deep, comprehensive sectoral discussions?
Thanks, Courtney. Wonderful to see you again. And yeah, it's a great question. I completely agree. I think we can't obviously change the climate, which cares about only one thing, which is the total number of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, by addressing only 4 or 5 sectors. This is clearly unfeasible, and particularly because sectors don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're all interdependent with each other. So if we make changes in one, there's no way that we can achieve the full result of deep decarbonization in one unless all the inputs and outputs that sector is connected to are also transforming. So yes, it is a holistic one. I still think, though, there's a lot of value for COP27 in particular. I'm picking a few sectors because not every sector receives as much attention as it needs to receive. And so the electric mobility one, as you've rightly said, I think is one which has been showered with attention and actually is sort of working compared to others maybe relatively well, and that has a group of leaders that are making ambitious targets. It has the private sector and countries kind of working together to think of what the regulatory framework could be, what the investments could be. There's a lot more that needs to be done, of course, in that realm, but compared to something like, well, let's take a different example, cement is a very different situation where this ecosystem around the sector is not working sufficiently well. There's a few leaders and there's a lot of others, shall we say, and the cross-cutting institutions are fragmented and not well organized. So that's one where a little bit of orchestration from a COP, from the presidency would be helpful. But also I think where it's extremely helpful is for the areas and the priorities which have been less of focus of investment, less focus of attention. And many of those are also not coincidentally the priorities of regions in the global south around adaptation and resilience. So I'd love to see the power, the convening power of the COP be directed to help lift up some of those areas as well. But I think your broader point is exactly right. Picking a few is not going to solve a systemic problem.
Thanks.
Vinette?
Yeah, yes, it was a wonderful, yes, it was a wonderful discussion, Thomas. So my basic question is regarding why are we not able to see, this type of success, as far as with the COP thing is concerned, as far as, with the trade deals, for example, with the globalization and with the NAFTA, which we saw, trade, prospering and the globalization growing. But with the COP, it is becoming like a, what you call it, like a talking shop, because simply because, once there's a financial crisis, it happens, for example, 2007 or even this pandemic, the entire thing, entire pledges, entire promises get, completely forgotten. Same is the case with the political democracy, complex democracy. Sometimes the governments change, Trump comes, then Biden, Trump goes, Biden comes there. So, and we find that, the entire, regarding the, for example, the entire policy reverses, due to that. So why are we not able to see such type of, stability and fulfillment of the goals, targets, etc. is concerned. For example, even with the geopolitics also, sometimes we see that the fossil fuel at $50 or $60 is not able to flourish, but suddenly it there's a lot of investment going on because of geopolitics. So why is that? That the slight change in geopolitics, economic landscape and democratic, for example, political setup, changes, political policies, the entire thing, undergoes a massive, reversal, So is that, and that is one of the reasons, that if you look at, for the over the last 40-50 years, the COP has not been able to be as successful as compared to other some of the other trade agreements, where, because in the trade agreements, the result, the politicians are able to see, the leadership is able to see the results in a very clear cut, transparent manner. But in that, climate goals, the success is not that transparent, and people find that, it will impact their, voters, impact their, economic prospects, etc. And so can you shed some light on it? Thanks very much.
No, thanks for that great question. So I'm a political scientist, so I take these questions by looking at how do you build power in society and how do different interests develop power to make certain policy outcomes. And I think it's pretty clear that over the first 30 years of the climate change challenge, the power has been insufficient to shift very deeply embedded patterns of carbon throughout our society. It'd be surprising if it were easy to suddenly shift the entire energy source the world has used for 200 years without a lot of transition. And those transition will affect incumbent interests in a very profound way. And so it's kind of impossible to imagine this happening in a sort of as nicely and as efficiently as we want to, if you take a sort of political economy lens. That is how I like to see the world, which is why I think it's so important to focus on the question of under what conditions can we actually shift those preferences? Because we know it's going to be a political contest. We know it's going to be, we're not going to be making the right, as far-sighted long-term choices as we should be. But that's sort of, step one. Step two is, okay, what do you do about it? How do you build up a climate change regime that can begin to change it over time? And I actually think the shift we saw from the sort of global deal model to the more catalytic model is an important recognition of that reality that's giving us at least a toolkit to begin to chip away at it. I think we still face, Greta Thunberg's right, we're not making enough progress fast enough to avoid the worst outcomes, and that is a major injustice. We shouldn't lose sight of that. But how do we then, what do we do about that, I think, is the question I'm trying to think through here. So can share your view on the limited success of the global governance to climate change in many ways, and empowered by that challenge, we should think about how we take it forward. At least that's how I see the problem.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thomas, if you don't mind, I also would like, until somebody else poses a question, just to take this opportunity. The first question I had was already answered when Corny was commenting about specific sectors. Now, I'm a green building expert, and so basically the idea of talking more about the construction sector and the emissions in the construction sector, how we consume building materials, the life cycle of our cities, etc. This is really relevant. It's very much underplayed. But then the realization is that we are headed towards a COP that is in a completely different demographic. Egypt is 60% young people, youth. Africa is predominantly young, looking for housing, for employment, and also whatever policies were happening and whatever pledges were being made in a post-COVID, and this, the economics is completely different. Some people may feel that the situation of COP moving around and also the post-COVID recovery and stuff poses a bit of a challenge because it's almost disrupting a conversation that's already, the ball was rolling, there are improvements and everything, and then you get, a different terrain. I think it could be an opportunity if it's seen that, for instance, the technologies that we are seeing in previous COPs, the suggestions, I'm not talking about the financing, but mainly the technology, the science, all of this, how can this COP coming up in Egypt make sure that the kinds of technologies and the information that we are having is affordable, is accessible, is culturally relevant to this part of the continent, and is sustainable so that the private sector can actually pursue it, invest in it, and build on it. Should COP be more, geographically sensitive? Should policies be decoupled from this continuous large bundling? And then, you really look at every case base sensitively so that the success of COP is not seen as the entire global movement moving towards one direction, as opposed to independent regions and countries doing what they can do with what they have and ensuring that there's justice in having this accessible. I mean, just your thoughts. I'm just thinking, what are the opportunities?
And a great question. I think the building sector is a great example of how a real focus on within a certain sectoral lens helps to really unlock solutions. Because if you start thinking about how do we transform the houses we live in to be both prepared for a climate change future, but also to reduce our contributions to climate change, you realize very quickly that you can't do it with only government or only the private sector, or only this actor or that actor. You need architects, you need construction companies, you need government planners, you need all these sort of systems to work together. And so the kind of weird way we've put international governance of climate change into these silos as either this or that, and it's governance here and private sector there, it doesn't really work when you get to that sort of solution mindset. And so I see this sort of shift in the way that COPs are organized, and the way who they bring in is really useful acceptance of the reality of how we actually make progress on climate change. So I agree that this sensitivity and this bottom-up nature is key. What I think it can add, though, beyond just letting 1,000 flowers bloom, is that actually, if you combine them, you're able to help everyone go faster. If you can figure out ways to do that by sharing ideas across borders, doesn't mean everyone has to do the same thing, but maybe we can learn from each other and how to do better. The key thing, though, that I think really can be unlocked here, which is more of the hardest way this collaboration should come together, is on the finance side, where there's so much that can be unlocked, and especially in Africa and developing countries more generally, if the investment is there. And getting that matchmaking between the need and the financial flows to really work through a wide range of systems is really key. And I hope we can see more kind of concrete things to do that. It's one example. One of the things I thought was most exciting about COP26 was an announcement between South Africa and a number of European countries and the US on a transition for South Africa's state-owned coal utility, which is basically Eskom is a big company that's state-owned and is quite inefficient, has a lot of coal as a major source of South Africa's emissions, but a huge source of employment in the country. And so one that we need to have a kind of package deal around to allow the government to unlock more emission. More deals like that, I think, are exactly the kind of things we want to see this COP encouraging.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your response. Lauren? Hi, Lauren.
Hi, how are you? My question is, well, it's somewhat connected to the previous question. So, when we're talking about climate change and everything, I have to keep reiterating this sometimes, just, when we go to the very organic level of the change that is necessary, the ground farmers, those locals who are on the ground just really doing the work of trying to take things piece by piece, whether it be in urban sectors or mainly in the agricultural sector, or in the just small town community sector of, trying to change and challenge the, emission release of carbon dioxide and trying to decrease, some of the consequences that are happening due to global warming. I guess my question is, again, just trying to reiterate this question, is what is being done to really make sure that the organic change makers, the organic, the cultivators, the farmers, and those who are finding these really creative solutions to really combat this current problem, what policies or what campaigns or what are being made for COP27 that really addresses the organic level of, combating, climate change and decreasing the huge percentage of CO2 emission into the atmosphere. And specifically, of course, we can look at in the States as well, but also in developing nations. Because I've seen a lot of work that's happening by youth and by, environmental engineers, who are on the ground and doing that. But it's, for some reason, just it seems that it's getting as much publicity as it needs. And when you like that, the publicity, it kind of impacts, the policy and people and in power getting behind it. When we go to these international conventions like COP27 and getting behind and supporting these initiatives. So are there any current campaigns that are really trying to hone in on the organic level and say, look, we need to pay attention to this because these initiatives are really can be very powerful and really, making change within a very limited amount of time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think what we've seen in the international process is a real step in that direction toward lifting up the ground, as I say, this groundswell of action we see around the world. And what can the international system contribute to that? Well, it can give a little bit of recognition, right? If you go to the COP in the last several COPs, but certainly COP26, And I strongly expect for COP27, you'll see, the negotiations are taking place in these rooms with governments speaking to governments, but then there's this whole, circus surrounded of different demonstrations and talks and meetings where people are talking about what they're doing and trying to find ways to work together to do it. So it's that kind of showcasing function that can be helpful. And I think it can also have this sort of learning exchange function, which can be helpful. The piece that's probably really helpful, though, as I say, would be providing a bit more of the direct support, financing, and tools that can really get beyond some of the sort of institutional big players that are easy to fund and down to like the really grassroots level where actually a lot of the funding is needed. I'm less optimistic about the ability of international systems to kind of create that sort of transition, but I think they can begin to at least showcase and point the direction of travel. But I think you're right that this is a huge, this is where the work actually gets done. And so this is going to be a really key thing for us to be focusing on in COP27 and beyond. And it's not, governments aren't the only ones, international processes aren't the only ones that we need to solve this, as I'm trying to say, but they do have this real need to engage with the grassroots level. So one final thought on this. One interesting innovation I've seen is them in the latest round of NDCs, we actually saw a lot more consultation by governments with society at large than we saw in the first round. A lot of the first round, some had good consultation processes, but many were sort of like a few consultants write it in a few weeks. It's not really owned by even maybe all the people in the government, much less all the people in that society. But actually now we're seeing a lot more begin to do that really well. And actually I'd highlight Chile as a country, which did a particularly interesting job of that by really bringing in the grassroots level to the formulation of the national policy, and which then ended up in their NDC, in their pledge into the Paris Agreement. So yeah, I think these kind of tools can really help to lift up the organic level, as you say, and give it the prominence it needs to have if we're going to make progress on this issue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Final question before we wrap up. Satyam, I have your hands up. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Thomas. Interesting presentation about the process of COP. I particularly want to ask a question on CBDR. How has the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities has been played throughout the COP, from Kyoto to Copenhagen to post-Paris? It raises the questions of what institutions can do, whether they can make this whole principle irrelevant or they are still relevant. For instance, we even failed as a collective to make Green Climate Fund $100 billion, right? So what is the future of common but differentiated responsibilities as a principle in the international institutions when it comes to COP? Thank you.
Really good question. So for anyone who may not know, common but differentiated responsibilities is a term from the original Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, a general principle applies across many areas of international environmental law. It basically says some countries have contributed a lot to the problem, some have contributed very little, some are still developing and may need more additional space to use some of the remaining carbon budget than those who have already taken up a lot of the carbon budget that we've already consumed. And so it's a very logical, ethical principle, right, that we should think about how to differentiate countries' contributions by this key thing. Very difficult to get agreement politically on what that looks like in practice, because every country wants to say, I'm a bit less responsible and you're a bit more responsible, essentially. And so it's very, very contested, but it's, as you say, Satyam, a really key principle. The Paris kind of system really kind of challenges some of that logic, because every country gets to determine its own pledge, right? And so it says, here's what I deem to be my appropriate contribution. There's a little bit of differentiation in terms of what the reporting requirements are and things like that, which kind of follows this idea of CBDR, as you say. But it's not really applying to the content of the NDCs in the same way it might have under a Kyoto Protocol type agreement. I would say, though, that the Kyoto Protocol style agreement didn't really deliver it either, right? Because even though it's sort of an internationally agreed target, It was, as I said, only a first step, and it was quite modest. So I don't think the right counterfactual is to say, the Paris Agreement model doesn't do it, and Kyoto would have. The Kyoto model manifestly didn't, right? So I don't think we can say this is some sort of lost chain. We've not lost anything, but we haven't necessarily made progress on that question either. I think the most important way to actualize it going forward is to focus a bit more on the timing around net zero targets. So the IPCC says that global net zero has to be achieved by 2050 to retain a 50% chance of remaining within the 1.5 degree limit. That doesn't mean that everyone needs to get to zero at the same time. Indeed, there's probably a responsibility of the more developed, more capable countries and actors to move faster, to create more space for the others to go when a bit more of a realistic pace for them. So that's where I think that debate has now shifted. But great question.
Thank you so much. And well, first of all, I have to thank you for, making such a topic that's really complicated sound quite easy and pretty straightforward. So thank you very much, Professor Thomas Hale. You've made the idea of the ecosystem around COP quite clear. There are so many questions that were in there that I felt were answered within the slides, and you delivering everything so logically. Thanks very much for your time. And the next webinar, I also want to thank the Gerhard Center for having such a great lineup around this topic. It's been quite well-rounded. The next webinar will be how to transform business for resilience in an era of continuous societal disturbance with Professor Christine Diamante. And I hope you will tune in. Thank you very much again, and have a